Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Uh-huh.
For this one, we are going to be talking about self-disclosure in psychotherapy. And, it's funny, this book was published back in 2006,
Mm-hmm.
but it feels more relevant than ever,
It really does.
especially in our modern age of oversharing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm really excited to kind of dig into this with you
Yeah, me too.
and see what kind of nuggets of wisdom we can uncover.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about this book is it starts off by talking about how self-disclosure isn't just something that happens in the therapy room, right? Like
Right.
we're constantly navigating this
Totally.
in our everyday lives. Like how
Mhm.
much do we let people in?
Mhm.
How much do we hold back? And there's this guy, Sidney Girard. He was like a big deal in the world of disclosure research.
Oh, okay.
And he called this whole thing like this existential challenge to be known or to remain hidden.
Oh, that's heavy.
Right.
Existential challenge.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know. And I feel like that's even more amplified in the therapy room, right?
Absolutely.
Because the whole point is to kind of go there and,
Yeah, you're really putting yourself out there.
yeah, you're putting it all on the table.
In a way that you don't with anyone else, really.
Exactly. And what's interesting is how we even got to this place where we're like, okay, let's go into a room with a stranger and bare our souls. Therapy has really changed over the years.
It has.
Like, we've gone from this model where the therapist was this detached expert who held all the answers
Right.
to this more collaborative approach where the relationship is seen as the heart of the healing process.
That makes sense.
Right.
Yeah, it's not just about
It's not just a prescription.
prescription. Yeah,
It's about the connection.
totally. And the book talks about how different therapy approaches view this whole disclosure thing differently.
Right.
Like you've got psychodynamic therapy,
Right.
which is all about unpacking those deep-seated patterns and the complexities of life. And then you've got CBT, which is more about identifying and changing those negative thought patterns.
Right. More solution focused.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, from your perspective, how do these different philosophies actually play out in terms of what a patient feels comfortable sharing?
That's a great question. And I think, while there isn't like a single study that's compared disclosure across every single therapy approach out there,
Right.
it does make sense that something like CBT, which
Mhm.
is often more short-term and goal-oriented, might lead to a different kind of disclosure.
Okay.
Right. It might be more focused on specific issues or thought patterns.
Interesting.
Whereas with something like psychodynamic therapy, which can go on for years,
Right.
you might find yourself revealing things you never thought you would.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because you're really delving into those deeper layers of yourself.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly.
And sometimes you cry.
Right. And sometimes you're surprised by what you find.
Totally. And you know what I find so fascinating is that what makes someone feel safe enough to open up in the first place.
Yeah, it's a vulnerable thing to do.
It really is. And the book talks about fear of judgment, shame, even little things like whether a therapist makes eye contact can make all the difference.
It's those nonverbal cues,
Yeah, absolutely.
that sense of being truly heard and seen.
And the book mentions some pretty surprising findings about what people choose to reveal or not reveal.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Like, did you know that patients often find it easier to talk about negative feelings about their families than positive ones?
Interesting.
Isn't that weird?
It is, I guess it makes sense in a way.
Why do you think so?
Well, maybe it's because we're often more comfortable expressing negative emotions like anger or frustration than we are with things like love and appreciation.
It's true. It's like we're afraid to jinx it or something.
Right. Or maybe we're afraid of seeming like we're bragging.
That's so interesting.
Or maybe it's because there's still this stigma around having like a perfect family.
Right.
So it feels safer to talk about the messy stuff. Oh, that's a good point. Because it makes us feel less alone.
Right. Like everyone's got baggage.
Exactly.
It's just a question of what you do with it.
Right. And I think that's part of what therapy is all about.
Yeah.
It's about unpacking that baggage and figuring out how to carry it with a little more grace.
I love that. A little more grace.
Yeah.
And the book also talks about how what's considered deep or revealing is so subjective.
Totally.
Like what might be earth-shattering for one person
Right.
could be like a Tuesday for someone else.
Exactly. We all have our own internal barometers for vulnerability.
That's so true.
Right. What feels incredibly exposing for one person
Yeah.
might be completely surface level for someone else.
It's all relative to your own experiences and your own comfort level.
Absolutely. And I think that's something important for both therapists and patients to keep in mind
For sure.
because it can really impact the dynamics of the therapeutic relationship.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Being mindful of those individual differences
Exactly.
is so crucial.
It is.
And speaking of things that are crucial, you can't talk about disclosure in therapy without addressing the big one, confidentiality.
Right. The cornerstone of therapy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the book brings up the Tarasoff case, which really changed the game in terms of what therapists are legally obligated to report.
Yeah, it's a heavy one.
It's a tough one to talk about, but so important
It is.
because it really highlights those ethical and legal boundaries that therapists have to navigate.
Right. And how those boundaries are there to protect both the patient and the public.
Absolutely.
And even though the duty to warn only applies in very specific circumstances,
Right.
it's understandable why it might raise some anxiety for people who are considering therapy.
Oh, for sure. It's like that elephant in the room.
Right.
Like, okay, we're going to talk about everything,
Right.
but what if I say this?
Exactly. And I think that's why those initial conversations about the limits of confidentiality are so important.
Absolutely setting those expectations from the get-go.
Yes, and being transparent about when and why confidentiality might need to be broken.
And the book also mentions how confidentiality laws can vary from state to state.
They do. It's a patchwork.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of.
It is, and I think it highlights the importance of therapists being really up to date on the laws in their particular jurisdiction.
Absolutely, you've got to stay informed.
You do, because ultimately it's about creating a safe and trusting space for clients to share their stories.
And that's what it's all about, creating that safe space
Exactly.
where people feel comfortable being vulnerable and sharing their true selves.
Because that's where the real healing can begin,
Absolutely.
when we feel seen and heard for who we truly are.
Couldn't say it better myself.
Right.
That's the magic of therapy.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about patients and, that whole dance they do with what to reveal and what to hold back. But what about the therapists themselves? How do they navigate this whole disclosure dilemma? Because the book talks about how the therapist used to be seen as this, like, blank slate.
Right, like a neutral observer.
Exactly. But it feels like things have shifted a bit since then.
Oh, absolutely. That whole blank slate idea, it's got some fascinating historical baggage.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it actually goes all the way back to Freud,
Oh, wow.
who believed that therapists should really try to maintain this neutral presence to avoid influencing the therapy too much.
Interesting. So he was all about keeping the waters from getting muddied.
Exactly. He didn't want anything to contaminate what he called transference, which is basically all those unconscious feelings that a patient might project onto the therapist.
Oh, that makes sense. It could get messy.
It definitely can, but here's the thing. Not everyone agreed with Freud's approach.
Oh, really?
Yeah. One of his contemporaries, a therapist named Sandor Ferenczi, he actually argued that too much neutrality could actually be harmful,
Interesting.
especially for patients who might have lacked that emotional connection in their early lives. Like, he believed that a genuine connection with the therapist was an essential part of healing.
I can see that.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of those early theories were still influencing how therapy is practiced today.
It's a great question, and I think it's a mix. The book talks about how things have loosened up a bit in contemporary therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like relational psychoanalysis and even some types of CBT are a little more open to therapists revealing parts of themselves when it feels appropriate.
Okay, so it's become more of a spectrum.
Exactly. And the book shares this great story about a therapist named M. Masood Khan, who was actually known for being very direct, even confrontational with his self-disclosures.
Oh, wow.
Like, he once told a patient who was kind of downplaying their struggles, he said, "If that's true, I should have been attending your funeral months ago and not listening to you telling me this damnable yarn today."
Whoa, that's intense.
Right. Talk about shaking things up.
It definitely challenges that traditional view of the therapist as this silent observer. Makes you wonder, when does a therapist sharing their own experience actually help, and when does it cross a line?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the book actually mentions that research on therapist disclosure is still a relatively new field.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah. But one study found something pretty fascinating.
Oh, yeah, what's that?
They found that while therapist disclosures were actually pretty rare, they were often rated as the most helpful part of therapy by the clients.
Wow, I guess there's something really powerful about those rare moments of connection.
I think so too. It's like that moment when you realize your teacher actually has a life outside of school.
Right.
And suddenly they become a whole lot more relatable.
Absolutely. It humanizes them.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what makes those disclosures so impactful. They make the therapist seem more human, more approachable. But what's interesting is that the research also found that therapists were a lot more ambivalent about whether their own disclosures were actually helpful.
That's so interesting. Why do you think that is?
It's a great question, and I think it speaks to those really complex emotional challenges that therapists wrestle with. Like, when is revealing something about yourself actually for the patient's benefit, and when is it fulfilling your own need to be seen or liked or understood? And how do you, as a therapist, deal with those feelings of vulnerability or even shame in the moment?
It makes you realize being a therapist is a lot more emotionally demanding than people realize.
It absolutely is. There's this constant dance between being present for your clients and also taking care of your own emotional well-being.
And the book talks about the importance of supervision for therapists, which makes me think of it as this kind of safe space for them to process those ethically or emotionally thorny situations where there's no easy answer.
It's so crucial. It's like having a seasoned map maker to guide you through those uncharted territories of therapy. Because even with the best maps, sometimes you encounter those unexpected detours or roadblocks.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And when those roadblocks pop up, how do you know which path to take?
Totally. It's like you can have all the training in the world, but sometimes you're just kind of thrown for a loop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I remember actually supervising this student therapist a while back who was struggling with this very thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she had this client who was really adamant about knowing her age.
Interesting.
Like the client was convinced that it would help them feel more comfortable opening up.
Okay.
But my student was really torn because, she'd been taught to kind of delve deeper into those kinds of requests.
Right.
Like explore why the client felt like they needed that information.
Right. Probe a little further.
Exactly. But the client was getting more and more agitated.
Oh, wow. So she was caught between a rock and a hard place.
Totally. And she ended up just disclosing her age.
Really?
Yeah, and the impact was almost immediate.
Wow. The client just visibly relaxed and said, okay, good. Now I can trust you.
Wow, so it actually worked out in the end.
It did. And it turned out that the client had had some really negative experiences with older authority figures in the past.
Wow.
So knowing that the therapist was closer to their age was really important for building that sense of trust.
That's amazing how these little things can make such a big difference.
I know. It's like sometimes that tiny disclosure can be the key to unlocking a whole deeper level of connection.
It's like that saying, people won't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Exactly. And I think that applies to therapy as well.
Absolutely. It's about being human.
It is. And it highlights how every therapy journey is different.
So true.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to disclosure.
You have to kind of feel it out.
You do. It's about carefully weighing those potential benefits and risks, considering the client's unique needs, your own theoretical orientation. It's a dance.
It really is. And let's not forget about those nonverbal disclosures.
Oh, right. Like those subtle cues that we might not even realize are speaking volumes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What are some examples of that?
Well, think about it. A therapist's pregnancy, a new wedding ring, even the art they choose to hang in their office.
Oh, that's true. You can tell a lot about a person by their taste in art.
Exactly. These are all forms of nonverbal communication that can actually spark some really important conversations in therapy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, I see you're wearing a wedding ring. Are you married?
Right. Or, I noticed that painting has a lot of blue in it. What does that color make you feel?
Right, right.
It's fascinating, actually. Research suggests that therapists are generally more comfortable with those nonverbal disclosures with children than with adults.
Oh, really? Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure. Maybe because kids are already so attuned to those nonverbal cues.
That's true. They pick up on everything.
They do, which kind of brings us to this really thought-provoking question that the book raises.
Okay, what's that?
What about the long-term impact of these disclosures? Like the things we share or that are shared with us, even those seemingly insignificant moments,
Right.
they can stay with us for years,
Oh, yeah.
Shaping our choices and our relationships in ways we might not even realize.
It's like those ripples in a pond. You never know how far their reach might extend.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what makes this whole topic of disclosure so fascinating.
It is. It's complex.
It is. And it's something that we're all navigating all the time.
Whether we realize it or not.
Exactly.
This has been such a great conversation.
It really has.
I've learned so much about the nuances of self-disclosure in therapy.
Me too.
And I hope our listeners have too.
Me too. And I encourage everyone listening to kind of pay attention to those dynamics in your own lives.
Yes. Great advice.
Both as someone who reveals and someone who receives those little pieces of the self.
Love it.
Hmm.
Such a good reminder. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But as always, thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating conversation.
It was my pleasure.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of psychology.